everyone understands that there's not 100 million illegal immigrants in the United States. They're telling us explicitly what their agenda is, and it is an agenda targeting not just, immigrants here or illegal immigrants even. It's about targeting Americans based on their background, and that's ethnic cleansing. That is the definition of ethnic cleansing.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this edition of Hate Comes to Main Street. My guest today is David J. Bier. He is the Director of Immigration Studies at the Libertarian Cato Insitute. I began by asking him about a viral moment from a few weeks back, an exchange between him and Senator John Kennedy, the Republican from Louisiana.
In front of God and country, you said, quote, they, referring to Republicans, think they can troll their way into us accepting ethnic cleansing, end quote. Your words, not mine. Did I read that correctly?
That was in regard to a
Did I
Department of
read that?
Homeland
Did I
Security
read
post
that?
about advocating 100 million deportations. That is what DHS has tweeted from their own account. 100 million deportations
hurts, doesn't
would be ethnic cleansing. You would be
Truth hurts,
removing
doesn't it?
1/3 of the country. So yes, there
Truth
are
can
people
just
within the
gut you like a
Department of
fish.
Homeland
And
Security.
you don't think this is hyperbolic? Give me 30 more seconds.
What does that moment tell you about the state of the immigration debate today in this country?
Well, it seems like a very significant portion of the population and even members of Congress are simply unaware of what the administration is doing, what policies it's enacting, what rhetoric it is putting out to the public, how it is justifying its policies. And if the public knew, or members of Congress and policymakers actually understood the extremes to which this administration has gone when it comes to immigration policy, maybe there would be an effort to rein in some of the overreach that is not supported really by anyone that I've met. These extremes are not extremes for the Democratic Party, or this is really policies and rhetoric that would be recognized as extreme for anyone. So when you talk about 100 million deportations, that's 1/3 of the United States. That's at least 50 million native born, US born Americans who would be in that group. That is what the Department of Homeland Security put out there. The head of the Border Patrol's operation in the interior of the United States, Greg Brevino, told the New York Times that he actually had a plan to deport 100 million people from the United States. And so, again, this is not something that's I've invented or that it's right wing talk show hosts talking about. This is something coming from official sources within this administration on public social media accounts. They haven't backed down, they haven't deleted these posts. And so there is a disconnect between what the administration is putting out there and what is actually reaching the public as what they're actually doing and what they're actually saying when it comes to immigration policy. And it's not just rhetoric, it's not just tweets and social media posts, it's also their own policies are extreme by anyone's definition. If you look at it, they banned half of all legal immigrants to the United States have now been banned by this administration. And that includes about half of all of the spouses of American citizens and their minor children who are reuniting with American citizens here in the United States. That's not a policy that anyone voted for. It's not a policy that this administration ran under. This is clearly overreach and not something that most Americans would believe is going on, but it is going on, and they've done it unilaterally, not going through Congress, executive orders and policy memos and even tweets and and press releases are making policy and banning huge numbers of immigrants from coming legally to the United States.
Yeah, this number of 100 million deportations is also a big talking point among the far right Christian nationalists that I follow. One of them interacted with you on X and tried to deny that it had anything to do with race, that it was not ethnic cleansing. And you called BS on that. Why did you react that way?
Well, if you look at what the administration said in its 100 million deportation tweet, it says this is the peace of a nation after 100 million deportations are carried out to prevent us being overwhelmed by the third world or something to that effect. That is explicitly targeting people based on their ancestry. And of course, it's about people's background. This is not about enforcing the rule of law. This is not someone broke some immigration regulation. This is about carrying out not just the largest deportation campaign in history. This is about targeting people who were born here, who are citizens here. 75 million of these people would be citizens, over 50 million would be US born. And maybe they don't fully know all of those numbers and maybe they think there's a few million more. JD Vance thinks there's 20 million illegal immigrants in the United States. Okay, fine. Everyone understands that there's not 100 million illegal immigrants in the United States. They're going they're telling us explicitly what their agenda is. And it is an agenda targeting not just, immigrants here or illegal immigrants, even. It's about targeting Americans based on their background. And that's ethnic cleansing. That is the definition of ethnic cleansing, is denying people their rights and driving them out based on their birthplace, their ancestry, what ethnicity they are.
As I'm talking to you, I am sitting in the 5th District of Tennessee, represented by Congressman Andy Ogles. He has called for repeal of the 1965 Hart-Celler Act. In his own words, he wants to, quote, make America look like America again. What is your take on that proposal?
Yeah, so the Hart-Celler Act reversed the partially it reversed the Immigration Act of 1924, which was enacted to block primarily Eastern European immigration, but it also effectively banned all Asian immigration, almost all immigration from Africa, as well as limit immigration from most of the rest of the world to just a trickle. And so that was the goal, just allow a little bit of immigration from Northern Europe, Western Europe, and pretty much exclude the rest of the world from being able to immigrate here. And so when you're talking about that as being the example, this is the goal of our immigration policy, should be to get back to a place where we only allow a tiny bit of immigration from Western Europe. And of course, even that amount, right? Even that amount ultimately, it was already slanted toward allowing more Germans to immigrate, but under the policy, we still ended up excluding all the Jews who were killed during the Holocaust. So again, you're advocating for the policy that kept the Jews in Europe to be killed, that excluded non-white immigration overwhelmingly. And so if your goal was to promote the repeal of that law, and of course, he's not going to allow any of the exceptions that were built into that law either. But the reality is you are making a claim about what it means to be an American. And what it means to be American has nothing to do with race. It doesn't have anything to do with where your parents were born. It has nothing to do with your ancestry, even. And so it's a view incompatible with that of the founders, which, of course, believed that anyone could come here and be an American regardless of their background.
And I have heard you say those 1920s laws were based on racism, racist policies. Can you expound on that just a bit?
Yeah, it was based on race science, the science of eugenicist science that divided people up based on what they perceived their racial stock were going to either help or pollute our bloodlines. And so when you hear President Trump talk about poisoning the blood of Americans, I mean, that really harkens back to the early 20th century racists who believed that these immigrants were not just going to come here and be a burden or commit crimes or whatever. They were actually going to make us, our race, the American race, less intelligent and more, um, you know, deficient in many ways. I mean, they talked about disabilities and they talked about mainly about IQ and intellectual pursuits. And then they used all these fake studies and phony science in order to justify why the only people who could be allowed to come are those narrow few countries in Western Europe who had the good racial stock. And so when you look at the bill that they designed it based on those criteria that you were going to only allow those few groups. Madison Grant, who's the great eugenicist of the early 20th century, wrote The Passing of the Great Race, and that was seen as the blueprint for this law. And then, unfortunately, you had that picked up by members of Congress and ultimately passed into law based on that premise. And it was noticed by the racists in Europe. Adolf Hitler praised the law, said it was an example to the world of using race science to design public policy. And his policies were, he saw his policies as being in line with that law that the United States Congress passed.
It's really disturbing when you go back and read, as I have in the last week or so, read material from the KKK in the 90s. Their rhetoric is almost identical. Have you seen that in your own
Yeah.
experience?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, the Johnson Reed Act, Senator Johnson, who was responsible for guiding that law to enactment, wrote on the anniversary of its signing that it was the second founding or the second founding, second declaration of independence for the United States, because the first declaration declared that all men are created equal. And this law was founded on the opposite principle. And he was open about it, that not all men are created equal. The laws was explicit about that and intentional about that, about excluding people based on their background. So, um, yeah, it is sort of shocking to hear the parallels. I already mentioned Trump talking about how you have this risk of immigrants poisoning the blood of Americans, talking about how immigrants have low IQ cultures, and all this stuff is totally in line with the ideology and philosophy in vogue at the time of early 20th century racism that's now, taking control of our entire government and policy when it comes to immigration.
People like Congressman Ogles like to talk about what they call the cost of immigration. They talk about Somali fraud. If an immigrant commits a murder, they argue that's evidence that the costs outweigh the benefits. They never talk about the benefits.
Yeah.
How do you respond to those arguments?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, when you look at immigration, it's been a huge economic benefit to the United States over the last 30 years. Just on the fiscal benefit side alone, $14.5 trillion in deficit reduction, it's sort of a minimum that we estimate over the last 30 years. And, going forward, it's going to have an even bigger effect in the future as immigrants continuously get more and more productive. The immigrants we have today and the recently arrived immigrants are the most productive immigrants we've ever had in America. It's basically the opposite of the story that's being told about them. They're more skilled, they're more productive, they work at higher rates, they're contributing to the well-being of Americans. They're improving our living standards as a result of the work that they do. They're not taking jobs, they're creating better jobs. And you can see this everywhere in the economy. You go to any restaurant, you see immigrants working in the back, supporting Americans in the front. You go to a construction site, you see immigrants working as manual laborers, doing hard, difficult jobs. And then you see Americans acting as supervisors and managers and more specialized and skilled positions where they're being supported by the immigrant workers. Those jobs wouldn't exist without immigrants. And then, of course, at the high skilled side of things, you have the same complementarity as entrepreneurs and new businesses and new innovations are created by the immigrants who come here that they wouldn't be created in their home countries. Some of them would, but many of them would just not exist at all if not for the economic opportunity that America provides to immigrants. So there's an enormous, enormous upside. I mean, they're twice as likely to start businesses. They're about 21 percentage points more likely to be working age. These people show up ready to work and contribute. They're more likely to have a lot of other good characteristics that we would see in people who are unlikely to commit crimes and cause problems. They're far more likely to marry. They're far more likely to go to church. They're You have a lot of these characteristics of the immigrants who come here and say, yeah, these are people who are not going to destroy our civilization. And if you look at the places that they go, immigrants are improving those areas. It's demonstrable. You can see it in the property values in the areas that they go. They're making places that were hollowed out by population decline improve. If they were destroying neighborhoods and creating all this crime and people wouldn't want to live there, they move out when the immigrants come. We see the exact opposite. We see people moving in when the immigrants come because there's more businesses, there's more consumers, there's more workers. So it's just totally backwards. The entire narrative couldn't be more wrong. And of course, if you actually look at the crime numbers, every data source that we have, every single one that we've looked at, shows the same story about immigrants and crime. They reduce the crime rate in the United States. Yes, there are more crimes committed when the population is larger, but if the crime rate is lower, then your likelihood of being a victim of a crime goes down. And what that means in practice, to put it bluntly, is that immigrants end up being victims of crimes that would have otherwise those criminals would have victimized Americans. And just to use the one example that Trump brought up in his State of the Union address was the woman on the train in North Carolina who was killed by an American. She was an immigrant who came under one of the Biden's special programs, who would have been called an illegal immigrant by most Republicans in Congress, would have said, this is one of Biden's programs to import illegal immigrants. She had humanitarian parole, but the bottom line is, if she wasn't there on that train, another American would have been killed in her place. And it's a horrible tragedy when anyone's killed for any reason. It was a horrible tragedy that she died. But when immigrants come here, they make a safer country because they're less likely to commit crimes. And that fact alone should give us reason to believe that immigration is a good thing for the country. It's not destroying our society. All the apocalyptic claims are just insane. But the basic argument they have, and really it's the only argument, is point to a few costs, ignore all the benefits. They can look to one crime and say that justifies keeping everyone out. They don't look at all the people who didn't commit crimes and who are bringing the crime rate down in the United States.
And yet that narrative is very powerful because I cannot tell you how many times I've heard, well, if we had a different immigration policy, so and so would still be alive today.
Yeah, absolutely. It's totally manipulative, because in a very, very narrow sense, you can make that argument, right? In the very narrow sense, but then you have to ignore all of the other consequences when you have more people who come to the United States who are not committing crimes, who are bringing the crime rate down. And the work that I've done research last year, looking at victimization rates, who's being victimized by whom. You look at it, immigrants are almost 70% less likely to be a victim of a crime by someone they know than a US born American. And that is an indication that they are being surrounded by other immigrants who are not committing violent crimes. They're not going out, and again, these are the victims themselves saying this. We're not interviewing criminals here and asking. No, the immigrants themselves are saying, I'm being surrounded by a bunch of people who are far more peaceful than the average American. The average American, almost 3 times as likely to a victim of a violent crime by someone they know in their social circle, in their area. And so that's a pretty good indication that there is an enormous gap in violence here. So you can't just look at, okay, this one person who was killed by an immigrant. You have to look at how many Americans are out there committing crimes against the immigrant population. And they don't care about that. It defies their narrative. It's not going to be headline news throughout the United States. It's not going to make the evening news. For ABC had this whole thing about, the woman who was killed in Chicago by an immigrant. They're not going to do that story when it's the other way around. So we never hear about the immigrants who get killed by Americans, and those are all tragedies too. We should care about those. We should want to reduce murder wherever it happens. But the end result of immigration is a lower crime rate and a safer country for Americans than would otherwise exist. And it's not just because of the fact that they commit fewer crimes. It's also because they revitalize communities that are dying, that are suffering from population death spirals as Americans move out and their tax base erodes, and then they can't afford police, and there's boarded up homes and boarded up buildings. The revitalization in areas like Detroit and Philadelphia and Cleveland I could go on. I mean, even in Tennessee, in Nashville, you can go to these areas that were hollowed out in the 70s and 80s. The population declines in major cities throughout the United States was severe. Many immigrants came to the United States after that. They built up these areas and revitalized them, and the crime rates went down throughout the country. Almost every major city in America has a lower crime rate today than at any point in the 1980s when the immigrant share of the population was half of what it is today.
Do you worry that the far right is winning the immigration debate? Are they shifting the Overton window to the point that it's hard for you to break through with your research?
Well, they certainly won the debate in one political party. And that's a huge concern because if you're not voting on immigration issues, if you're not sufficiently concerned about how this agenda is going to play out in terms of civil liberties and loss of economic vitality and all of those things, if you're primary concerned about taxes or regulations or other things, whatever they might be, and you sort of downplay the risk, which I've talked to a lot of Trump voters and when I talk about, they're going to do crazy things on immigration, what they all say is, well, during the first Trump administration, they didn't do those crazy things. Now, that's a little bit, incorrect, but in general, no, they kind of didn't outside of COVID, when things got a little bit weird when it came to immigration, illegal immigration. But overall, I would say, yeah, they weren't they were kind of a normal Republican administration when it came to enforcement, but that was all before January 6th. After January 6th, all the normal constraints on governance, all the constitutional rule following, all of the norms were obliterated within the Republican Party, within the Trump coalition, all of the people who could happily fit within the Republican Party and stay silent on, immigration, but were willing to stand up for the Bill of Rights and for democratic governance, were driven out of the party. And so now coming in the second time, he doesn't care about the Fourth Amendment, the First Amendment, the Second Amendment with, you see the justifying the murder of Alex Preddy in Minnesota by just saying, well, he had a gun. So therefore, obviously, he's a threat. I mean, it's the stuff that's coming out of this administration on basic civil liberties is more extreme than anything we've seen by any administration, especially outside of a real war. You know, this is an agenda that is the most corrosive to constitutional governance that we've ever had. And so it was not shocking to me at all that we have racial profiling in the streets where people are being American citizens are being forced to carry their papers to avoid arrest and detention and harassment by people. I'm not shocked that they're violating the Fourth Amendment and going into people's American citizens' homes to try to detain people that they think might be there. And so all of these abuses should come as no surprise when you have a party that survived the biggest constitutional scandal in our entire history. And so all of these people who have latched on to Trump, they're not believers in the rule of law. They're not believers in the Constitution. And so, yeah, they've won within their party. And it's not just immigration, it's all these other issues as well. But the public at large isn't buying it anymore. That they kind of come to the realization, I think, that what he's doing is dangerous and wrong and they don't support it. Any poll that asks people, do you want mass deportation or do you want people to have a chance to apply for legalization, it's almost 2 to 1 in favor of a path to legal status for people who are here. So it should be heartening to people that he's kind of juicing up the pro-immigration side of things, but it is a problem when every election seems like it's a coin flip and one party is just totally in the bag for the most anti-immigrant rhetoric and policy that we've really ever seen outside of the 1920s.
A couple of final questions. If you had a chance to speak directly with my Congressman Andy Ogles, what would be your message for him?
Well, my message is, what about the rights of citizens? I mean, don't you care about the right of Americans to be able to associate, contract, trade, marry, talk with, be around? I have Muslim colleagues who work at the Cato Insitute promoting classical liberalism, freedom, individual rights, freedom of religion around the world. And you're saying those people should be deported, expelled, put in concentration camp, whatever the case might be. They're not part of a society, American society. They're not real Americans. I mean, that is disrespectful to the rights, my right to hear what they have to say. I would never even know that these incredible scholars exist if not for the fact that we were able to bring them here to write on these topics and promote these ideas, not just in the United States, but around the world. So all of the anti-immigrant policies ultimately come back on us as Americans. Our rights are affected by every policy proposal to ban immigration, to deport people, to round them up. We have a right to engage with people who are born in other countries. And when that right is ignored, the results are catastrophic and authoritarian. And that's what we've seen under this administration, with spouses of US citizens being rounded up, detained, arrested, and deported, with racial profiling, with arrests of US citizens and detentions of US citizens for exercising their First Amendment rights. And maybe he's willing to defend all that stuff. I don't know. I haven't asked him. Maybe maybe he just doesn't care if you're not totally on board with uh, white only America or a Christian only America. But most people in America don't agree with him on this. And so, if you're going to go after everyone who disagrees with your agenda, then you're really going after most of the country. And of course, it flips around. When the devil turns around on him, where is he going to hide when there are no constraints on government going after their political opposition? And that's a real threat, honestly, because if it if it if it does come to fruition that this administration can get away with all of these abuses, there's absolutely nothing that would prevent a new administration from going after the likes of him and the people that he loves and cares for.
Final question. From your perspective, where do we go from here?
Yeah, I mean, look, it starts with conversations like this. It starts with talking about the problems. Talking about the real issues here. Um, I do think there's hope. Like I said, people are realizing that this agenda has gone too far, and more Americans are going to be affected and caught up in these policies that are so ill-conceived and so not based on public safety or protection of the public. So I am hopeful that there is a movement afoot to change these policies and come up with a better system. I keep coming back to the fundamental question of, what do you believe that people regardless of their um, ancestry or background or birthplace, can be a benefit. And if you believe that, okay, so then what are the criteria that you would have for people to come to the United States? What do you, it cannot be the case. And I believe if we put it to a vote, most Americans would not say we should ban all Muslims, we should ban anyone who isn't a Christian, we should ban, entire races, religions, countries from immigrating to the United States. I haven't encountered that. I'm sure there's a minority of people out there who would buy into that, but that's not going to fix our problems. That's not taking into account people's individuality and the way in which individuals can benefit the country. And so I think anyone would want a more tailored approach to immigration policy. And that's the conversations that I've had when I worked for a Republican member of Congress in a deep red district. I would have dozens of conversations with Americans who are concerned about immigration. And I would ask them, well, what immigration policy do you think we should have? Who should be allowed to come to America? What are the criteria that you have? And they would say things like we shouldn't allow people to come here and get on the voter rolls and immediately start getting welfare, and we should want people who want to work and contribute and have a place to live and aren't homeless on the streets and aren't living in hotel rooms in New York City provided by the taxpayer. These are all things, okay, you don't want people who are criminals. That's another one. You come up with this list, and whatever the list is, whatever it looks like, it is almost always far more generous, far more liberal, and far more humane than our actual existing legal immigration policy in the country. And so I think basically anyone in America would come up with a better immigration policy than the ones that Congress have actually imposed on the country. And so once you have that immigration policy, we can debate the particulars of that, of those things that I mentioned, but whatever we come up with, it's going to be better than the system that we have now. And so that's what makes me hopeful as well, is once you actually start having real conversation about the rules and the requirements, people will come up with a system that's better than the one that we have.
Well, David, I appreciate your time.
Of course, anytime. Thanks for having me.